Carly Plenty Arrows is a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota, and in February of 2021, Carly was arrested and taken into custody for a nonviolent crime. During her time at Pennington County, Carly began to feel severely ill, and had expressed this to the jail medical staff. Despite her critical symptoms, Carly was given little medical help. Her eyesight became blurry, and her temperature went up to 107 degrees. It was only then that she was taken to a hospital. It would have been a matter of hours between life and death if the prison staff had not finally sent Carly to the hospital. Unfortunately, medical negligence is not an uncommon practice towards Indigenous women in prisons. Not only are Indigenous women overrepresented in prison, but within the prison system itself, Indigenous women continue to be victims of systematic and institutional racism. The structure of the penal system is based upon gender and racial structures. Because men make up the majority of the prison population, it is then assumed that women in the system are not deserving of attention. And this is reflected in the way that women, especially Indigenous women, are treated. Historically, women's prisons were designed to make women better at being womanly, fragile, and feminine. However, this had only applied to white women. Indigenous women at the time, and still now, are not seen as real or proper women, and because of this, they were jailed with men. The placement of Indigenous women with men puts them at a greater risk of being sexually assaulted by other inmates and guards. When it comes to the problem of Indigenous women and their incarceration and treatment within prisons, Australia is an important country to analyze. There has been an increase in prisoner rights campaign in Australia. However, this is paradoxical when looking at the increase in punitive punishments being used as well. In Australia, Indigenous women are incarcerated at 375 people per 100,000, whereas white women are incarcerated at 16 people per 100,000. And while there have been increasing campaigns against the disproportionate rate of incarceration of Indigenous women, the policies that are put into place do not address structural issues. One example of this is seen in the Better Pathways Strategy program that was implemented. Among policymakers, this program was revered as a comprehensive and progressive milestone in women's prison reform. However, when looking at what actually happens, the program does nothing to address entrenched structural issues that continue to target and victimize Indigenous women. The treatment of Indigenous women within prisons is reflective of the broader treatment of Indigenous women outside of prisons within society. In Canada, Indigenous women make up 4.3% of the population. However, they are 16% of all female homicide victims and 11% of missing women. The epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada is a reflection on the country's failure to address the issue and the failure of the criminal justice system in bringing justice to these families and women and girls. The continued criminalization of Indigenous women and girls puts them at risk of becoming murdered or missing. It is also due to this criminalization that the system continues to neglect and ignore the suffering of Indigenous women within the penal system, and it continues to perpetuate the cycle of discrimination. The way that Indigenous women are treated by societal institutions is a manifestation of the way that capitalism works. Those who benefit from capitalism are usually white men who have benefited off the suffering and labor of marginalized and racialized communities. Capitalism allows for sexual assault against women to perpetuate, especially against Indigenous women and other women of color. Women's bodies are commercialized and objectified through the way that they are used to sell items and products. It encourages the idea that women, especially Indigenous women and women of color, are disposable and subhuman. It will only be through the dismantling of capitalist structures that we will be able to dismantle the prison system. The prison industrial complex must be brought down in order to protect Indigenous women from continued colonial abuse.